with LinkedIn and YouTube. There we go. All righty. Welcome to this week's episode of Next Level Play Therapy. Today, I want to talk about some tips or things to think about to overcome some mistakes that I see happen pretty often in the play therapy process. And I would say these mistakes are ones that we all make if we've been in the field. Doesn't matter if you're brand new getting started, if you've been in the child and adolescent field for a while, play therapy for a while. I think we all tend to, I call these traps, or this is a trap. And I want to talk about what is really going to be a more important focus to help your traumatized clients heal. And that's really what I want to focus on today, helping your client overcome the impact of trauma. And so let's get started for today. So if you're watching live, I would love to know who's here. Post your name in the comments, especially also if you're watching on the replay. I would still love to know who's watching. I know a lot of people do watch on the replay and for the video on YouTube or LinkedIn, also in my Facebook group. Hello, Facebook group peeps. So post your name in the comments. What population do you work with? Are you working with traumatized clients right now? What are some of the specific things that you find happen some things that you end up really needing to address when you're working with traumatized children and teens? And what play therapy modality are you using? Those of you listening on the podcast, welcome. Also, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So if you're listening on the podcast, I'd love it if you'd pop over and leave a review. What is helpful? And also for those of you who are watching, if you're watching on LinkedIn, feel free to connect with me. I'd love to chat more. If you're watching in my Facebook group, you can comment in my Facebook group. And then also I'm on Instagram. For those of you watching on Instagram, then send me a DM or post a comment. So what are the mistakes I find? And I think one of the biggest mistakes that happens when you are working in play therapy, and in particular, this time I would say trauma, I think sometimes we get into that trap of thinking that I just need better play therapy activities. I just need to know what kind of activities I can use in the playroom. And don't get me wrong, I am a play therapist. I love learning about activities and the newest and latest activities. I think, that's how we help our clients access those therapeutic powers of play for healing, right? The thing is, though, if that's your focus, then the likelihood you're going to feel like at some point usually in the really in the change process, you start feeling a little lost, like you don't know if what you're doing is helping. You're still getting the phone calls from parents or caregivers that their child is struggling. It's not going well. They're telling you all of the things that are going wrong. And you're starting to doubt yourself, like maybe you don't know what you're doing, maybe you are horrible, maybe even you should get out of the profession, or you start to second guess yourself after the sessions. You start thinking, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I messed it up. Oh, I've made just the biggest mistake ever. I've just ruined the whole play therapy process. And the reason those things tend to happen is a couple of things. And I would say the biggest one is what I want to talk about today. And here's the thing. One of the things that there was a study done a while back, and this was in the Psychotherapy Networker, and I forgot exactly what the name of the article was. I posted it I've even talked about it in previous live streams. So you might have to go back a couple years. um, Maybe we'll post that one, put a link so that you can find it easily. But here was the thing. The Psychotherapy Networker, they were talking about burnout. And so they wanted to talk with the experts in the field, the therapy masters, so to speak, and what helped them not to get burned out. So this is my take on the article and my paraphrase on the article, because I found it really powerful. And I thought, oh my gosh, it just validates everything I've been saying for years. And that is when they were focused on burnout. But what they found was for these therapy masters, the experts in the field who get amazing treatment outcomes for their clients, what they found was these experts start with the end in mind. And what I mean by that is they conceptualize what needs to happen from start to finish. So they kind of go in holding that framework, possibility of what needs to happen through each stage of the change process. So they're already starting to think about what needs to happen. And to me, the only way you can do that is if you have an actual framework. You have a framework that you're using. And to me, that's one of the first things to think about is what framework are you using rather than over focusing on what play therapy activities is actually going to make the difference. Like this, if I just find the right play therapy activity, that's going to unlock everything. Well, maybe it will. And you'll get a lot more positive outcomes. I think you make a bigger impact if you actually have a framework that you're using. Focus on the framework, and then you'll figure out what activities are going to work where. And so, what do I mean by using a framework? So, your play therapy framework is basically the play therapy model that you're using to help your clients navigate through every stage of the change process. It's your case conceptualization is also part of that process. And your case conceptualization is going to be influenced by your play therapy model. So you start with your case conceptualization, and I've talked about this in previous episodes. So if you're really interested in this topic, you can definitely go back and watch some of those previous episodes. Case conceptualization is basically what exactly is activating the problem and what are the patterns that are sustaining it. So, what are the patterns you see in your client? Maybe, what activates it? When does it get activated? When is it not activated? What happens when it gets activated? And then also, patterns include the relationship patterns within that family system, including that parent-child relationship or caregiver relationship, and how do caregivers respond. So all of that information, you want to make sure you're gathering all of the information at that very first session. You want to make sure you're gathering it because that information is what you're going to use to create the foundation of your case conceptualization to get started. And then you're going to continue to assess through each stage of the change process. So you use all that information to formulate your initial case conceptualization or your working hypothesis. I'm holding this working hypothesis based on the information that I've gathered, based on my play therapy theoretical model. And I'm going to use that to help me with my clinical decision making of what am I going to do in this session? When am I going to do it? At which stage am I going to do it? How are caregivers going to be involved in the process? What exactly is that going to look like? Who can be involved and who's probably not a good idea to be involved? At the beginning, maybe there's work that you need to do in order to get that caregiver involved. All of these things are what you're going to be considering as part of your ongoing decision-making process. And it's going to be grounded in your play therapy model. That's your framework. Your framework is your play therapy model that tells you, okay, in the beginning of this process, we do this. And then in the change process, we do this because we're conceptualizing the problem is due to these factors. So to fix that, then we're going to use this strategy. So that's what happens is when people over focus on the activities, then what happens is they start, I call it the spaghetti against the wall strategy. They start thinking, oh my gosh, that one didn't work, so I'm going to use this one. And then they start kind of throwing all these strategies in the session, so to speak, using strategies kind of indiscriminately, figuring out activities to use indiscriminately, and then finding that it's kind of like the hamster on the gerbil wheel. You're going nowhere fast, but you're working really, really hard. And then you end up getting tired, overwhelmed, mentally exhausted, and frustrated, starting to second guess yourself and doubt your capabilities. And then what I find is more effective is to take a step back and then think about your case conceptualization and your play therapy model and what does it say to do in the sessions, and then choose your activities based on that. That being said, all of that, if you're using child-centered play therapy, then that is, if strict child-centered play therapy, then you're just going to follow the model because you're not choosing activities. You're just following, not just, but you're following your client's lead using the model, and your model influences the way in which you show up and what that intervention, so to speak, looks like. Meaning you're following, you're not leading, but you're also using tracking statements, and your way of being in the session is really, really important. So, so then the model that I like to use, excuse me, when I'm working with children and adolescents who experience trauma, I love using a neuroscience and attachment lens. I think it gives us so much information to understand children's behavior and what might have happened for that behavior to occur, what might have activated that behavior. Now, keep in mind, when you are working with children, humans, let's just say children, adolescents, parents, adults, when you're working with humans, they're complex, right? Humans are complex beings. So there's that whole nature and nurture component, meaning what is their default wiring, so to speak, like their personality style, their introvert versus extrovert? Are they highly sensitive? Are they not? Some of these kind of wiring personality traits. And then there's also the nature part, which is experiences that have occurred that influence their behaviors, their beliefs about themselves, their beliefs about others, their beliefs about relationships. We've got decades of neuroscience and attachment research to help us understand that. And that's one of the reasons, like when I do trainings, and including like a trauma training. So I have a training about using play therapy with traumatized children and teens that's coming up. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the end. So if you're interested in taking a training to help you use a neuroscience and attachment framework, then you're definitely going to want to stick around till the end, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. When I do my trainings, I like to use a neuroscience and attachment lens. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the neuroscience and attachment information and what the research says, so that we can package all of that in our case conceptualization. And then we're going to use a play therapy framework that will integrate neuroscience and attachment to help us figure out what to do in each stage of the change process. So the thing you want to do is so I like to do that because when I'm working, that kind of helps you in the beginning when we formalize and begin your case conceptualization. So when we get to the actual framework and we walk through it and we do all the activities, then you're going to have a framework to know what you're going to do throughout each stage of the change process. And then you can plug in those activities. And then when, not if, it's really about how often and when, and then how do you get back out of it when you get a little lost or frustrated or feel like nothing's working. Then you can take a step back, go back to your case conceptualization using neuroscience and attachment theory and like mentalization, polyvagal, all of those things. We go back to that and then figure out, okay, what does my theoretical model say about these things that are going on? So when you start getting the phone calls from the caregiver saying nothing's working and they're still struggling, then you're not going to start second guessing yourself. You're going to take a step back and you think, okay, here's what they're reporting. Based on my model, here's what I think needs to happen. And then that's going to influence your decision making about what to do next. Your play therapy model is really your framework, is what guides you. The theoretical underpinnings of that are how you're going to make sense of what the problem is, as well as what type of activities and interventions you need in order to heal trauma. So, for example, if you're using an integrative, when I'm using neuroscience and attachment theory, then I'm going to use more of an integrated model. So using an integrative play therapy model means you are blending two or more theoretical models together. And I talked a lot about this last week in the live stream last week, or if you're listening to the podcast, it'll be the podcast last week. What that means when you're using an integrative model. And so if you're using an integrative model, you're blending two or more theoretical models together. So your case conceptualization is going to be influenced by those specific models. And then what you do in each session is also going to be influenced by those theoretical models. So for example, let's say you are you're using an integrative model and you're using somatic experiencing and EMDR, and maybe you've got a little IFS in there, right? These are more of the kind of popular trauma approaches that we are now integrating into play therapy. So how do you do that if you're integrating that? Well, if you're integrating them, you're taking the theory underneath of those are all kind of neuroscience-y and attachment oriented models, and you're blending those together, and then that's going to influence how are you making sense of what the problem is, right? EMDR has certain protocols that you're going to follow, and what would that look like? So maybe if you're using more of an EMDR approach, and then maybe you're blending in a little IFS in there, having them work on doing some parts work, that's going to influence what you're doing in the sessions. So, or maybe you're using more of a trauma focused CBT model and you're blending in some polyvagal theory, which means you're going to be working a little bit on helping them getting tuned with their body and where are they experiencing things, and then helping them to regulate their nervous system, and that get back into maybe dorsal vagal so that they can feel safe. Sorry, ventral vagal, not dorsal vagal, so they can feel safe. Or how do they tell if their sympathetic system is activated? How do they tell that in their body, right? So these are the theories that you're using. And if you're integrating these, then you're thinking about what those theory models say, and you're thinking about, like, trauma focused CBT will have has a structured approach, tells you what you're going to do in each stage. And then if you're blending in some polyvagal, maybe you're using that information in this stage, maybe the beginning stage of trauma focused CBT. What types of interventions would you choose? So the thing is, you're not just it's not just random, it's not just pulling out activities. You're thinking about your theory model and what your theory model says about what's going on. Why is your client getting activated, and what each stage of the change process looks like, so that when you are choosing your interventions, you're going to know where to plug those in. So like, that's why I like, in the beginning, I really like to focus on that case conceptualization part in the beginning, where we go through what attachment theory looks like, interpersonal neurobiology, polyvagal, mentalization. What does all of that mean? And how does that impact and explain what's going on with my client? And then I'm going to use that information with my play therapy framework that's going to guide me through each step of the change process. So that, to me, is the key. Having that framework is the key, and understanding that your framework is your play therapy model, or your integrated play therapy model, still means it's theory based, and your theory is going to influence how you make sense of what's going on with your client and their trauma, helping you identify trauma triggers. What do they need to settle down their nervous systems, helping them to reprocess and overcome the impact of that traumatic experience to where they can thrive and grow, because that's the goal, is that post-traumatic growth. And how are you integrating caregivers in that process? Because when your theory, like, I use a neuroscience and attachment approach, so we're thinking interpersonal neurobiology as well. That means I'm also thinking about my client's relationships, or maybe that child's parent. How can I integrate that parent into the change process? Can I integrate that parent in? What exactly is that going to look like? Because maybe my client is in foster care and they're not living with their biological parents. Or maybe they're living with another relative, maybe an older relative who uses old school parenting and doesn't buy into the new way of parenting. And so what does that look like? What is that dynamic between that child and that caregiver? And how can we help caregivers be part of the healing? Because that's where the long-term healing is going to be sustained, in their environment with the people in their lives long after they're not in counseling with you anymore. So that is it for today. Let me just go through and do a little recap. Today, we're really focusing on why play therapy, playing and activities in play therapy aren't really enough to heal trauma, that we really need to focus on what framework you're using. So, in your framework, also, you're thinking about also your relationship. Of course, we want to make sure it's always three things, right? The way that I look at it, what the relationship is key. First and foremost, you've got to establish safety. I talked about that in a episode 2 weeks ago. So if you're interested in that, then you may want to go back and listen to that episode 2 weeks ago. I've talked about it in a bunch of other episodes as well. So you may be interested in watching some of the other episodes. This week, I really want to focus on, so there's the three things, right? There's relationship, your framework, and then keeping up, the way that I look at it, keeping up with what the latest research says and what's going on, what are the trends going on. And some trends are good, some trends sometimes aren't always so good. And I think this is where research can help out, where we kind of look and see what's working and why is it working. So today is really about focusing on what framework are you using, rather than trying to get the latest activities and focusing too much on the activities. We're balancing that out, activities with your framework. You want to learn the framework first, because your framework is what guides you through each stage of the change process. It's going to influence your case conceptualization and influence. So your case conceptualization is like, how are you making sense of what's going on with your client? And so what are the roots of the problem, essentially, and what are the patterns that are sustaining it? Patterns that the child is engaging in, as well as the relationship interaction patterns in their environment, which will include caregivers. I would say it also includes like school and what's going on at school, those areas where they spend a lot of time and have an influence on their day-to-day activities. So, and then how is your framework guiding you through each stage of the change process? What does your framework say to begin to do in the beginning? What does your well, when my mouth works again, what does your framework say to use in the middle? And it's going to be influenced by how your theory model explains what's activating the behavior, what are the roots of the problem. So for example, Adlerian play therapy is going to explain it differently than Gestalt play therapy or child-centered play therapy. And so that's going to influence what you do in each stage. So in Adlerian play therapy, you're going to do certain things in the beginning, you're going to do certain things in the middle, and then how it's also going to explain how you know when your client doesn't need to come anymore. So If you're using more of an integrative approach using neuroscience and attachment theory, then that will influence how you make sense of what's going on with your client. And then if you're blending together theory models that are going to um, show you what to do to facilitate change, like EMDR or somatic experiencing or trauma focused CBT, some of these other trauma based or neuroscience and attachment based model that we use with trauma that have been getting really good results for adults. How do we take those and bring those into the play therapy world and blend those, which would be using two or more models to create an integrative approach? When you do that, you're still basing your case conceptualization using neuroscience and attachment on those models. And then what are you going to do in the session? So that's when you pick the activities are going to be based on those models. Like what you're going to do with EMDR is probably going to look a lot different than what you would do with trauma focused CBT or even somatic experiencing. It's going to look different because your theory model says it's going to look different. And when you're blending them, what you're doing is you're taking aspects of those model and putting them into a framework, what you're going to do in each stage. And then you choose activities that will fit that model. And then that way when you get lost or when you feel like things aren't working or when you're getting the phone calls, then you have a framework to go back to that's going to help you like take a breath, figure out what's happened, and then it's going to explain what you need to do moving forward. Well, that is it for today. So if you're interested, I do have a training coming up. It's called Healing Trauma Using Play Therapy, a Neuroscience and Attachment Approach. And so, like I said, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what neuroscience and attachment theory tells us about the impact of trauma. We're going to look at interpersonal neurobiology. We're going to look at polyvagal theory. We're going to look at what Peter Fonagy and his colleagues have said about mentalization. We're going to look at attachment and how all of that from a neurobiology and attachment standpoint influences the impact of trauma on your client. So it'll make sense then where some of their behaviors are coming from, help you look at those behaviors and that impact through that lens. And then we're going to look at a model that's going to integrate play therapy and specific models. I was actually trained on a model for trauma. This was I think it was back in 2010, probably, using a model. It was called the SITCAP, Structured Sensory Intervention for Traumatized Children, Adolescents, and Parents. And I loved this model because back in the day, they were talking about the sensory aspects of trauma and creating a framework using aspects of neuroscience, but also understanding the way in which trauma changes the way we think about ourselves, think about others, think about the world around us. That trauma basically hijacks your nervous system. And then this specific model kind of shows you, not kind of, but this specific model has, here's what you do in the initial stage. Here's what you do in the middle. Here's what you do in the end. Here's how you know when they're making progress. Here's how you know when something has gotten activated. Here's how you address that. Here's how you work with parents. Here's the role of parents. So your theory model is going to explain what your role is as a therapist, what is the child's role, what is the parent's role, and help you navigate your decision making about what to do in each stage. What's your role? What's their role? And then when you're choosing activities, you know where to plug those in. And so that's the model that I was trained. I still love it. And now I've integrated in, as we've learned more over the last couple of decades, as we've learned more, what does that look like? And how can we integrate more of these neuroscience and attachment, this neuroscience and attachment information that we've learned? How can we blend all that? So I have a specific framework. We're going to look at the frameworks. We're going to look at what's your role in each stage, what's the child's role, what's the parent's role, choosing activities. We'll do tons of activities in the training. So the training is going to happen. It's called Healing Trauma Using Play Therapy, a Neuroscience and Attachment Approach. You're going to get a theoretical model that's going to, using a neuroscience and attachment lens, it's going to help you know what to do in sessions, what the stages are. We're going to go over activities. And I'm also a firm believer that community is important, especially in play therapy. This is hard, holding those hard stories. It's hard knowing what to do all the time. Sometimes we could just use a community of people who just seem to get it and understand, well, we don't have to explain what play therapy is, or we don't have to hear things like, oh, their kids just pull out an activity. This is a community of play therapists called Play Therapy Elevation Circle. It's a new membership that I launched back in March. So it's closed right now, meaning we have people in the membership, but currently, while it's still in its kind of founding member and beta format, I've really been working on, getting that community built up. But the thing is, it's still important to have community. So what I did is, if you register for the training, if you attend the training, then you get 2 months free. And what that means is, when we have our monthly consultation calls, we can staff cases about trauma. We can help problem solve. We can give support. We can help you figure out what needs to happen. Are they making progress? Making sense of their play therapy behaviors in the training, in the sessions, and what's going on with that. There's also resources in there. There's a community group feature. So in between meetings, we can post and give support in there. So when you register for the training, you get 2 free months of Play Therapy Elevation Circle. And then the other thing we're doing in the training is we're talking, I'll give some tips on working with parents. We'll kind of talk a little bit about play therapy themes that you typically see for traumatized children, really trying to help you get really grounded in a framework and understanding what's going on so you can help your clients heal from the trauma that they have experienced. So that is it for today. If you're interested in the training, then pop over to my website at rhplaytherapytraining.com. Click on the courses page. It's Healing Trauma Using Play Therapy, a Neuroscience and Attachment Approach. So pop over to my website, rhplaytherapytraining.com. That's renewingheartsplaytherapytraining.com. Click on the courses page. There's 2 options. You can attend in person, or virtually. All right. So I will see you next week. And feel free to message me if you have any questions about the training. And I will see you next week.